She thought she married a warrior for peace until he handed her a knife on their wedding night. 3 days after burying her parents, Claire stepped into a marriage with a man who didn't speak her language, into a world where trust and survival had the same weight. The tent breathed like a living thing, canvas walls pulsing faintly with the rhythm of the wind outside, each gust a whispered warning across the plains. Firelight licked the dark, stretching shadows over tanned hides and worn beads. Smoke curled lazily toward the flap, carrying with it the scent of pine and something sharper burning sage, or maybe blood. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She'd never been this close to silence before. Not the kind that crept, not the kind that watched. Wakasa didn't speak when he stepped forward. He didn't need to. The air shifted with him, colder somehow, despite the flame between them. His eyes held hers dark, unreadable, unmoving. Then, without ceremony, he reached into the folds of his sash and pulled out a knife. It wasn't large, not gleaming or ceremonial. It was the kind of blade that had seen meat, rope, wood, war. The bone handle was smooth from years of grip, and the edge, though worn, still caught the light with dangerous precision. He didn't offer it like a gift. He placed it in her hand. Before we go further into Claire's story, the settler girl who crossed a line, married a warrior, and stood between two worlds on the edge of war, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These are more than stories. They're echoes of choices, of survival, of the fine line between peace and bloodshed. Your support helps us bring tales like this out of the shadows. Every like, every subscription, helps us keep these fires burning. It takes only a second, but it means everything to us. Thank you. Wait first. Purpose first. If I die tonight, he said in a voice low and certain, you will use this on yourself, or on them. The silence snapped. Claire blinked. Her fingers tightened instinctively around the handle, then loosened just as quickly. Her lips parted, but no words came. Not because she didn't have them, but because none of them made sense here. In this language, in this place, in this impossible moment. She'd imagined many things: cold nights, cultural customs, perhaps even distance, but not this. Not a demand for blood before the sheets had cooled from ceremony. Her heart thundered against her ribs, loud enough to drown out the wind. Was this a test? A warning? Some rite she didn't understand? Her mind raced back to the half-dozen whispered warnings she'd heard before the union. He doesn't marry for love, he marries for war. I don't understand, she whispered, finally. Wakasa didn't blink. Then you listen. He knelt by the fire, motioned toward the tent flap, and in one motion, drew a circle in the dirt with his finger. They come, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, not for you, for me. But they will find you here, with my fire, my food, my name. His hand moved to the edge of the circle. They will not see a bride, they will see a traitor. Claire stared at the blade again. It was heavier now. Not in weight, but in meaning. It didn't glint anymore. It pressed. And if I run? She asked, voice hollow. You will die tired, he said simply. Outside, the wind howled through the bone chimes strung at the doorway. They didn't ring like bells, they rattled like warnings. She should have been afraid of him. But what chilled her more was the clarity in his voice, the certainty. He had no interest in harming her, but he was already teaching her to survive. And that terrified her more than any threat could have. The grave was shallow. The preacher's hands were blistered from digging through frostbitten clay, and his prayers murmured through cracked lips drifted unnoticed into the still prairie wind. No choir, no mourners, just Claire, just the shovel, just the silence that came after the last handful of dirt thudded against the pine lid of a coffin too small for two grown bodies. Her mother had been folded against her father's chest, as if even in death she still reached for his warmth. Claire didn't cry. Not because she wasn't broken, she was, but because the tears had dried up days ago, wrung out during the long fevered nights that ended in that final silence. The preacher wiped his brow, muttered something about God's will, then walked away without looking back. He'd buried 7 families this winter. Faith had grown thin as the soil. She stayed after the cross was hammered into place. Her dress borrowed, patched, borrowed again, clung to her like a wet rag in the cold wind. She clutched the last thing her mother had sewn. A threadbare shawl, more holes than wool. No brothers, no sisters, no land in her name. The cabin she'd grown up in had already been stripped for firewood by neighbors who'd once smiled when they passed her on Sunday mornings. Now they avoided her eyes. A girl, with nothing, was a burden or a prize. She'd heard the whispers as she passed the general store, low voices in the corners, men pretending not to look. Pretty face, strong hips, shame she's all alone. One had laughed, the kind of laugh that made her skin crawl. She'd left the store without her flour, clutching a half loaf of stale bread like it was armor. It was old Widow Burke who'd said it. Leaning close, voice almost apologetic. "If you're smart, girl, you'll go to the Lakota. There's one Wicasa. They say he protects his own. And once he marries, no one dares touch what's his." Claire had flinched. "Marry? It ain't love you need right now," the widow said flatly. "It's a line they won't cross." The widow's gaze had softened then. "A man like that doesn't take in strays for free. But he don't lie. Not like the ones here." Claire hadn't responded. But something in her moved. A tick, a pulse, a flinch toward the idea. That night, as the wind howled outside the abandoned cabin, and someone knocked once, then waited too long, she made her decision. 3 days before the blade. 3 days before the promise of violence. Claire packed what she had into a flour sack. A shawl, a tin comb, her mother's locket, and the blade her father had once used to carve his initials into the doorway. She'd planned to use it on herself if things got bad. Instead, she carried it like a dowry. She walked through the snow, past the edge of white settlements, and into the parts of the land where names shifted and maps blurred. Toward the man she'd never met. Toward Wicasa. She didn't know if he'd take her. She only knew the next knock might not leave her alive. The sun dipped low behind the cottonwoods, casting long shadows over the snow-patched grassland. Smoke from 2 fires twisted upward into the twilight, mingling with the thin cries of birds returning to roost. Claire stood between them, between the old world she'd fled and the unknowable one that waited ahead. Her boots were damp, her hands were raw, her breath fogged the air, uneven and shallow. Yet her posture was still, held upright by fear, pride, and something harder to name. Wicasa stood across from her, just beyond the second fire. He had not spoken a word since she arrived. Not even when she'd stepped into the outer ring of the encampment, her bundle clutched tight to her chest like a lifeline. Others had murmured, eyes trailing her like they were watching a storm roll in. But Wicasa? He had only met her eyes once and nodded. Now he stared through the smoke, expression unreadable, arms at his sides, knife on his hip. Not aggressive, not welcoming, just watching, waiting. An elder moved between them, her spine crooked with age, but her voice was steady. She spoke in Lakota, clear, rhythmic. Each syllable dropped like a stone into water, rippling out in ways Claire couldn't begin to grasp. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the weight. This was not ceremony for show. This was binding. A second elder joined, painting symbols in the dirt between the fires, 2 circles that never touched. One marked with an eagle feather, the other, a strip of leather. He spoke fewer words. He simply placed the objects into the flames, and the wind did the rest. There were no rings, no white dress. "No, I do." Claire stepped forward, as directed, and placed both palms on a piece of hide stretched over the fire pit. The elder painted a single line down her wrist, red ochre mixed with ash. Then she nodded toward Wicasa. He didn't hesitate. He mirrored her gesture exactly. His line was black. The two lines didn't match. They weren't supposed to. When he looked up, his eyes met hers again. Not with affection, not with curiosity, but with confirmation. Something had been agreed upon, something larger than either of them. He offered no smile, no explanation. And yet it was done. The onlookers said nothing. They turned away slowly, each returning to their tents or fires or duties. The air did not fill with cheers. There were no songs. Just the sound of cold wind brushing past deer hide and snow-crusted branches. Claire swallowed. Her mouth tasted like smoke. Wakasa stepped aside, motioning silently toward a tent marked with symbols she couldn't read. Her tent now. The union had been witnessed, recognized, protected. But as she walked inside, the silence of the space struck her harder than any vow. No warmth greeted her. No welcome waited. Just the same rhythmic stillness she'd felt the night she buried her parents. This wasn't peace. This was a pause in a storm she didn't yet understand. The fire in the center of the tent crackled low, throwing shadows across the stitched seams of hide and the beadwork hanging along the walls. Claire sat near it, arms wrapped around her knees, listening to the way the flames spoke in tongues older than English. Her fingers were stiff with cold, but she didn't dare move closer. Not yet. Not until she knew what he would say. Wakasa stood near the entrance, tall and still, outlined by the last of the daylight leaking in beneath the flap. He hadn't removed his outer furs. His knife was still strapped to his hip, his bow leaning against the far wall. He wasn't at ease, not with her, not with the quiet, and certainly not with the fact that now, by custom and ritual, they were bound. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You stay inside after dusk." His voice was low but unwavering, like the crack of frost underfoot. It wasn't a suggestion, it was the first rule. Claire nodded slowly, unsure if he even saw it. "No matter what you hear, not wind, not voices, not names you know, you don't step out." Her mouth opened slightly, a question forming, but his eyes turned to her then sharp, clear, unblinking. She closed her mouth again. He continued, "You speak no lie under this roof." This time, she flinched. Not because she had planned to lie, but because the way he said it made the idea feel like a sin older than language. Truth, in this space, wasn't a moral ideal. It was a requirement, like firewood or water. To lie here wasn't just disrespect, it was dangerous. Wakasa stepped forward and dropped a bundle near the bedding jerky, dried berries, and a waterskin. He gestured once. "You eat, then sleep." Claire stared at the offering, but didn't move toward it. He didn't soften. "You owe no debt except truth." The third rule. It landed heavy, heavier than the others. She hadn't expected kindness, but she'd thought maybe there'd be a price, a trade. Something to earn her keep in this new place. But truth? He asked for no obedience, no service, only truth. And suddenly, she understood. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about affection, or even alliance. It was about survival. His, hers, the tent itself. It was a space carved out between threats. Every rule was a line drawn against the world pressing in from all sides. Outside, men with guns might call her stolen. Inside, she was something else, but only if she followed the rules. The flicker of the fire cast his face into halves, one half lit, the other unreadable. He watched her one last time, then turned toward the bedding on the opposite side of the tent and lowered himself to the ground with no further words. Claire sat still, the food untouched, the silence surrounding her like a second skin. Her parents' voices echoed faintly in her head. Soft things about marriage, about hope, about beginnings. But this wasn't a beginning, it was a threshold. And she had just crossed into something far older than any promise she'd ever known. The wind shifted just before noon. carrying with it the scent of wet stone and distant smoke, subtle, but enough to make the dogs stir at the edge of camp. Claire noticed it too, a strange sharpness beneath the usual wildgrass and pine, but she didn't understand its meaning. Wakasa did. He paused mid-task, repairing a bowstring, and turned his head slightly, listening. By dusk, the scout returned. He came in fast and low, his horse lathered with sweat, hooves barely making a sound on the packed earth. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, but his eyes carried weight far beyond his years. He dismounted before the fire circle, dusted with red clay, and without waiting for ceremony, muttered something in Lakota, his voice tight. Wakasa listened, silent, then asked one question, short, low, firm. The scout nodded. Claire stood by the drying racks, hands dripping with river water from scrubbing hides. She watched the exchange, not understanding the words, but understanding tone. The boy's hands trembled slightly. His gaze kept drifting toward her like she was already marked. When Wakasa turned to her, she dropped the hide. "They come," he said. "Tonight." Claire stared at him, heart slowing. "Who?" He didn't blink. "Your people." She took a step back. "What do you mean, my people?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the pouch at his waist and pulled out a small token, a carved disc of wood with a name etched into it. "They think you were taken, but it is not about you. You are the excuse." Claire frowned. "Taken? I came here, I chose." "They don't care," he interrupted. "You crossed a line. Now they need to erase it." The words hit her harder than the river's current ever could. She could see them in her mind already, their faces. Men who used to tip their hats to her father, share cider at the harvest, help lift fence posts, and carry crates. Now, they carried rifles. "They mean to rescue me," she whispered. Wakasa met her eyes with something colder than scorn. "They mean to burn this camp, and call it justice." Claire's stomach turned, her knees nearly gave out. "You have to tell them I'm safe. That I'm not." "I will not speak with guns," he said, turning to the scout. "They come for blood. They will find it if they enter this land." The scout nodded and rode off again, likely to warn others, prepare traps, mark trails. Claire stood rooted in place, shivering despite the heat of the coals behind her. Wakasa approached slowly, stopping only when he stood close enough for her to smell the leather and smoke on his clothes. "I gave you my roof," he said quietly. "Now I give you warning." Claire shook her head. "But I know them. Some of them. I used to. They are not who they were when you left. Fear changes men faster than time." He stepped back, and she saw the full weight of what tonight meant etched into the lines of his face. Claire had crossed the river thinking she was escaping danger. She hadn't known danger was already swimming in the current behind her faces she once trusted, now masked with righteousness and flame. She wrapped the shawl around herself tighter, and for the first time since coming here, realized she no longer knew where home was. The night came on fast, a bruised kind of dark, settling over the camp. No moon, no stars, just the faint red glow of watchfires and the creak of sinew in the wind. Wakasa had said little since the scout's return, but his movements had changed. Quicker, sharper. Every motion had a destination. Every glance, a calculation. He had tied back his hair, readied his weapons, checked the fire lines. Claire followed him in silence, steps uncertain over the hard-packed earth. She wanted to ask if the others were afraid, if they would fight, if they even knew she was the reason blood might be spilled tonight. But no one looked at her, not with blame, not with comfort. She was invisible again, only this time, it felt like mercy. Wakasa pulled aside the back flap of their tent and motioned for her to follow. She did. He moved past the cooking area, past the bundles of firewood, past the stone-lined pit where they boiled hides. Then he stopped before what looked like a pile of sleeping furs. Without a word, he bent and yanked them aside. Beneath was a pit, just wide enough for a body, maybe two, if they pressed close. It was carved into the ground, reinforced with bone and mud, sealed with old cedar planks. The smell that rose up was dry and earthy. But beneath it, something else: time, memory, and something that made the hairs on Claire's arms lift. Wicasa looked at her then, eyes like flint. "If I say run," he said, "you go here. And do not make a sound." Claire stepped closer, the firelight from outside flickering behind them. She looked down into the hollow and froze. There were bones. Not fresh, not clean, not arranged with reverence. They were scattered, half buried in soil, some snapped, some stacked like someone had lived down there once, or died trying. Bits of cloth still clung to a rib cage. A child's shoe lay forgotten in the corner. She turned to him, face pale. Who were they? Wicasa didn't look away. People who trusted too long, hid too late. Claire's throat dried. "You put me in there? I kept it, for when we have no other choice. But the bones, why haven't you? Why would you?" "Because I remember," he said, voice sharper now. "What happened when I forgot. That's what you're marrying into. Not a man, not a tribe, not peace. You married into memory. Into consequence." She wanted to step back, wanted to scream, to accuse, to demand a softness he had never offered. But something in his face stopped her. This wasn't cruelty. It was caution. The kind born from living past the end of something. The kind only survivors understood. Wicasa placed the furs back over the hollow and stood. "You may never need it, but if you do, it is better to know where the ground opens." Claire nodded, slowly. She hadn't married a warrior. She had married a warning. The fire crackled low in the center of camp, its flickering light casting long shadows across the snow-dusted earth. Men sat in silence, sharpening blades, checking arrows. Women braided hair with shaking fingers, their eyes never straying far from the tree line. Even the dogs had gone quiet. Tension curled through the air like smoke, thin, choking, inescapable. Claire sat near the edge of the circle, wrapped in her mother's shawl, the pit still vivid in her mind. She couldn't stop seeing it. The bones, the shoe, the way Wicasa hadn't flinched. 100 questions pressed against her lips, but none made it past her teeth. Not here. Not with these people who had accepted her in silence and might die because of it. She felt like an intruder, a spark that could ignite a funeral pyre. Then a voice, small and certain, broke through the stillness. "He saved me too." Claire turned. Everyone did. The voice belonged to a girl, no more than 10, with 2 thick braids and a gaze too old for her years. She sat near one of the elders, hands folded around something silver. Her face was calm, not defiant, not emotional, just clear. "No one knew where I was," the girl continued, lifting her chin slightly. "They took me from my mother, hid me in a wagon, said they'd make me proper. White dresses, quiet voice, no words in my own tongue." Her fingers clutched the object tighter, a locket, tarnished but intact. She opened it briefly, just enough for Claire to catch a glimpse of a faded photo. A woman with high cheekbones and a fur-lined collar. "Wicasa found me, cut the ropes, carried me across 2 rivers. Her voice didn't tremble. "But he made me promise something first." Claire leaned forward slightly. "What did he ask?" The girl's eyes met hers, dark, unblinking. "He said if anyone ever came again, anyone with soft hands and lies in their voice, I had to scream, bite, bleed, run. He said safety doesn't ask nicely. It warns." The fire popped sharply, as if punctuating her words. Claire looked around. No one interrupted. No one comforted. They simply listened, as though this story had already been told in other shapes, by other mouths. As if everyone here had made a promise like that, at some point, with blood still fresh on their palms. The girl clutched the locket to her chest again. "He said I could stay, but not soft. Never soft again. Claire didn't speak. Her throat had gone tight. She glanced across the flames. Wakasa stood in the shadows, arms crossed, watching not the girl, but the woods beyond. Always the woods. As if danger had a scent, and he could smell it before it arrived. Was this what it meant to be protected? Not to be saved, but to be reshaped, hardened, sharpened, like steel pulled from the fire? Claire couldn't tell if she felt grateful or afraid. The sun had just dipped behind the ridge when the first hoofbeats broke the hush. They came slow at first, measured. Not a charge, not a raid. A test. The sound of men trying not to sound like men, as if restraint could make them righteous. Claire heard them before she saw them. She stepped outside the tent, the cold biting hard across her cheeks, breath fogging as the three riders emerged from the dusk. They didn't stop at the camp's edge. They rode right up to the outer fire circle, their horses snorting clouds of steam into the dark. One held a rifle lazily across his lap. Another sat taller, one hand on the reins, the other on the hilt of a hunting blade. The third, he held a torch, not lit, not yet, but ready. Claire's heart stuttered. Her eyes locked on the torchbearer. Elias. He used to leave flowers on her windowsill, wild violets, clumsy bouquets wrapped in twine. Once, he'd carved her name into the bark of a birch tree. Now, his face was hard, not cruel, just certain. He didn't look at her, he looked past her. At Wakasa, who stood unmoving at her side. "You got something of ours," Elias said. His voice was low, just loud enough to carry. The other two shifted in their saddles, eyes sweeping the camp. Counting tents, looking for signs of weakness. Wakasa didn't reply. Elias lit the torch. Claire stepped forward, a hand half raised. "Elias," she said. Her voice cracked. "You know me." He looked at her then. And for a second, just a second, his expression flickered. A glimpse of the boy she'd known. Then it vanished. "You were taken," he said flatly. "Ain't no shame in that. But you can come back. We can forget this happened." "I wasn't taken," she said, louder now. "I came here. I married him. You don't get to decide what that means." Elias glanced at the others. One of them laughed under his breath. "She sounds like she's been taught," he muttered. The flame on the torch flared. Wakasa took one step forward, the silence around him thick as smoke. His eyes didn't move from Elias. "Let them test the wind," he said quietly. "They'll all return." The words weren't a threat, they were a prediction. Elias shifted in his saddle, jaw tight. The torch wavered. Claire looked at him, really looked. There was no hatred in him. Only the dull certainty of a man who believed he was fixing something broken. He thought he was doing right. That made him more dangerous than any enemy. Wakasa raised his chin slightly. "3 fires," he said, his voice now reaching the trees. 3 riders, go back, or stay. But this land remembers trespass." The men hesitated, one cursed under his breath. Elias looked away first. They turned without another word, the torch snuffed against Elias's boot. The horses disappeared into the trees. Claire exhaled. Wakasa didn't move. "That was the first circle," he said. "Next time, it won't be watchers." Claire didn't ask what came next. She already knew. The moon had climbed high by the time Claire slipped from the tent. The fire in the center of camp had burned down to quiet embers, casting the whole clearing in a dim, red glow. Most of the others had turned in, resting in the tents quiet before the next threat. Even the dogs lay still, ears twitching but eyes closed, lulled by the illusion of peace. Claire moved like smoke, soft-footed, breath shallow, one hand brushing the flap closed behind her. She paused just outside, listening. Waiting. Nothing. The hollow in her chest had grown since Elias's torch. She couldn't shake the image of his face, the flicker of recognition before it hardened. He wasn't a monster, neither were the others. Not all of them. They were afraid. Misled, maybe. But not evil. And if they attacked, if they died, was that something she could carry? She had told Elias the truth. She had meant it. But that was before the silence returned. Before she remembered how fast men could vanish into red snow. Before she started wondering what Wakasa might do if they crossed the line. She crept past the last row of tents, her shawl tight around her shoulders, and ducked beneath the brush at the edge of the trail. The night air was sharp, but clear, the kind that carried every sound for miles. A twig cracked beneath her heel. She froze. Still nothing. She moved on. At the base of a stone outcrop, she knelt and pulled a small folded scrap of paper from the hem of her dress. The handwriting was shaky, ink smudged in places from the rush of it, but the words were legible. Sheriff Thomas. I'm alive. I came here by choice. No one forced me. But things are not what I thought they would be. I don't want bloodshed. Please, if you can stop this, if you can tell them to turn back, do it. They'll listen to you. Just don't come at night. Don't come with guns. Claire. She folded it again, tucked it beneath a loose rock that jutted from the earth like a tooth, and whispered a quiet prayer, half to God, half to no one. Then she ran back. The camp hadn't stirred. No alarm, no voice. Just the steady breathing of a place bracing for impact. She crawled back into the tent and lay there, awake, staring at the shadows above. She told herself she'd done the right thing. That it was better to try. That maybe the sheriff would come alone, speak calmly, broker something before the blood started flowing. But outside, in the trees, the wind began to change. And far from camp, beneath that rock, the letter weighted ink drying like a fuse. Claire had reached back toward the world she left behind. She didn't know it yet, but the hand she offered was about to be used as a weapon. The fire in the tent had died down to embers, its warmth barely reaching the woven mats where Claire had been lying just an hour ago. But now, the bed was empty, the furs still warm. Wakasa stood over them, unmoving. The flap at the back of the tent fluttered once, then stilled. He didn't call her name. He didn't need to. He stepped out into the night like a blade drawn in silence. The moon was bright enough to silver the earth, every leaf and branch outlined like ink against pale skin. He moved quickly, without sound, following the faintest traces. A scuff in the dirt, a bent stalk of grass, the tremble of something recently disturbed. He found her at the edge of the camp, beneath the trees, crouched near a stone. The moment their eyes met, she froze. His expression didn't change. No fury, no raised voice. Just the steady certainty of a man who'd seen this pattern before too many times, in too many forms. He didn't speak as he reached down, pulled her gently to her feet, and walked her back through the brush. Claire didn't resist. Not because she wasn't afraid she was, but because whatever punishment she had imagined, whatever brutal reckoning she thought would come from breaking his trust, wasn't in his face. When they reached the tent, he opened the flap for her, let her step inside, followed after. Then he said the only words she'd hear from him that night. "Tonight, you will not sleep beside me." She turned toward him, heart hammering. But there was no cruelty in his voice, no spite. He stepped past her, reached for his bow, and began checking the string. "You will stand guard with me." She stared at him, confused. He glanced over his shoulder. "If we die, we do it side by side." Her breath caught. This wasn't punishment. It was elevation. He had seen her choice flawed, dangerous, made with a heart too tangled in two worlds, and he hadn't cast her out. He hadn't locked her away. Instead, he was handing her a role, a burden. A place beside him on the line between life and death. "You still trust me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Wakasa didn't look up. "Number, but I trust what the night will make of you." She wanted to speak, to explain, to confess, but the moment had passed. Words were too soft for the task now. He handed her a knife. A second bow. Gestured to the small slit in the tent's hide near the front, the watch point. She took her place, and as the wind howled through the trees and the scent of smoke began to rise from somewhere distant and wrong, Claire understood. He hadn't demanded silence. He hadn't demanded her body. He had demanded her presence. And now, side by side, they waited for the storm to come. The sheriff's hands were calloused, sun-split, and steady. They always had been. He'd steadied horses during storms, steadied dying men long enough for their last words, steadied a rifle against shaking shoulders more times than he cared to count. But now, in the fading light of his cabin, his hands trembled just slightly as he unfolded the letter. Claire's handwriting was unmistakable. Careful loops, uncertain spacing. The kind of script taught by a mother who'd insisted that neatness meant dignity, even in a world that rarely returned the favor. He read it once, then again. She was alive. She had chosen to go. He stared at the final line. "Don't come with guns." The sheriff's jaw clenched. He turned toward the fire, crackling in the iron stove, and stared into it for a long, silent minute. Then he folded the letter once more precisely and fed it into the flames. "She chose this," he muttered to no one. "Let her live with it." The paper curled, blackened, and vanished. Outside, a wind picked up across the plains, brushing through the chapel bell's rusted frame. It didn't ring, it groaned, like it knew what was coming. He'd seen it before. Years ago, in another town with a different name. A woman who didn't do what was expected. A man who stood beside her. A crowd too proud to walk away. But he'd learned then truth doesn't survive mobs. And law bends quick when fear writes the script. He thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. Later that night, in the saloon's back room, the mood was less contemplative. Voices rose over whiskey and sweat, over the clink of rifles being cleaned and loaded. Elias sat at the corner table, one leg bouncing. He hadn't slept since riding back from the Lakota camp. He hadn't told them everything, not yet. Just enough to stoke the anger, just enough to ignite something righteous in the hearts of men who'd already decided what sin looked like. "She's being used," someone growled. "They got her saying things she don't mean. That ain't choice, that's brainwashing. Sheriff ain't gonna lift a damn finger," another spat. Too busy polishing his badge and pretending neutrality. The door opened. A man stepped inside, face clean-shaven, clothes too neat for the road. His eyes swept the room like a surveyor calculating, cold. He wore no star, but he wore something worse. He carried certificates, bounty documents, with signatures, seals, authorization. "I hear you boys are heading north," he said smoothly. "I can get you through the forest trail. Quicker, cleaner." Elias looked up. "What's your stake in this?" "I collect what's due," the man replied, pulling a rolled map from his satchel. "You want to rescue a girl? Fine. But I'm here for the man she ran to. Wakasa's got a price on him that's worth more than any wedding band." No one questioned it. By morning, there were twice as many horses saddled. And now, they weren't riding for justice. They were riding for profit. The air before sunrise had a different weight to it, thin, taut, waiting to snap. It smelled like ash and cold metal. The stars were just beginning to vanish into the bruised purple sky when the first crow gave its warning call. A second later, the scout at the ridge whistled, sharpened twice. They were coming. Claire emerged from the tent, already lacing her boots, hair braided back tight. Her hands shook, but not from fear, at least not the kind she'd known before. It was something else now. The kind of fear that knows it must move. Wakasa was already at the central fire. He wasn't assembling weapons. He already had them. Bow, axe, 3 blades, one slung across his back. He didn't glance at her as she approached, only extended one hand. In it, the knife. The same one he'd given her on their wedding night. But this time, he didn't frame it in death. He held it out with reverence. Claire took it. He looked at her then, really looked, and said, "No one takes what is under my roof, not even me. Do you understand now?" She did. It wasn't possession he was speaking of. It wasn't control. It was protection drawn as a line in the earth, and now, she stood on his side of it. The blade was not a leash. It was a vow. She nodded. Across camp, others stirred. Mothers gathered children, slipping them into hiding holes beneath tents and behind rocks. Men took up position in the trees, not panicked, practiced. This wasn't their first siege, but it might be their last. Smoke began to rise from the southern tree lines, subtle at first, curling gray fingers snaking toward the sky. Someone in the mob had already begun lighting the edges of the woods, a tactic to box them in, to flush them out. Fire before gunfire. Dominate the land first. Claire's heart pounded. She gripped the knife tighter. Wicasa motioned for her to follow, and they climbed to a rocky outcrop that looked south. From here, they could see the road winding in, and the silhouettes of riders beginning to emerge from the trees. 10. Then 15. Then more. She spotted Elias among them. His hat low, jaw set. Not at the front, but close. And beside him, a man she didn't recognize, clean cut, too clean. Government. She felt it in her gut. Claire looked to Wicasa. "Is it too late to stop them?" He didn't answer. Instead, he touched 2 fingers to his lips, then pressed them to the earth. "If I fall," he said softly, "you do not bury me. You keep running." Claire shook her head. "I won't." "You will," he said. "And you'll remember this. They do not fear warriors. They fear truth. That's why they ride with fire. Truth needs no weapon, but it burns just the same." The first gunshot cracked like a whip in the distance. Claire flinched. Wicasa didn't. He drew his bow. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the war already had. The first man through the trees never made a sound. An arrow found his throat before his boot touched soil. He toppled into the snow with a soft thud, red already blooming across the white. The silence that followed was worse than the shot. It was the breath before a scream, the beat before a charge. Then came the roar. The siege broke like a wave, shouting. Hooves, the crack of gunfire. Smoke spilled from the tree line, followed by riders in staggered formation, their faces banded with cloth, eyes wild and searching. Fire caught on the brush behind them, rising high into the dawn-hazed sky. The camp was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. Claire froze. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed. The smell of blood, the crunch of hooves on frost. The sudden sharp snap of a tent pole splitting under weight. She saw a boy barely 16 take an arrow in the leg and vanish behind a crate. A woman shielding 2 children with her body, her face turned to the sky. And then she saw Wicasa. He moved like a shadow, low, fast, methodical. He loosed an arrow, rolled to cover, then rose with his axe in hand. One rider made it too close. Wicasa lunged, met him in a crash of limbs and steel. The horse reared, the man fell. But not before a bullet caught Wicasa just beneath the ribs. Claire's breath caught. She saw him stagger, his body twist from the force of it. Wicasa. He didn't answer, just pulled the axe free and turned toward the next threat. Her legs still wouldn't move. Then a torch landed beside her. It hissed as it struck the cold ground, flame licking at the damp grass. She stared at it, the fire crawling like a warning, snake, and something broke loose inside her. She ran, not away from the flame. She stamped it out with her foot, cursed, grabbed the torch, and hurled it back toward the trees. It disappeared into smoke. Somewhere, a man shouted. Claire ducked behind a fallen post and drew the knife he'd given her. Her hands trembled, but she held tight. Every part of her screamed to hide, to find the hollow in the earth and wait it out. But she remembered his voice. "If I say run, you go here." But I didn't say run. Wakasa hadn't said it. And so she stayed. A rider came toward her, gun raised, shouting something she couldn't hear over the chaos. Her body moved without thought. She ducked, swung wide, slashed across the horse's flank. The animal bucked violently, sending the man flying. He landed hard, didn't get back up. Claire stared at the blood on her hands. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like becoming something new. She turned, found Wakasa again bleeding, but still standing, still fighting. One hand pressed to his side, the other drawing a new arrow. Their eyes met. For the first time, he nodded not as a command, but as respect. The wind shifted again east this time, hot with smoke, thick with the sour tang of gunpowder. The worst of the first wave had broken. Bodies lay scattered along the outer edge of camp, hooves trampled deep into the earth, arrows sticking up from the ground like tall grass turned violent. The survivors had retreated just beyond the tree line, regrouping, shouting orders Claire couldn't make out. But something had changed. The rhythm was wrong now, slower, measured, less rage, more intention. Less mob, more machine. Claire stood with the blade still in her hand, her hair soaked with sweat, ash smudged across her cheek. She watched Wakasa approach, his gait stiff with pain but unbroken. Blood had soaked through his side, dark against his tunic, but he moved like a man who would not give that wound permission to slow him down. "They're coming again," she said. "I heard them regrouping." Wakasa didn't answer immediately. He climbed the short ridge above the camp higher ground, where he could see the valley road. The sky was burning red now, not from sunrise, but from fire licking along the edges of the trees. Shadows danced in the distance, shapes of men and horses, but they didn't charge. Not yet. Then she saw it. One of them near the front wore blue. Not flannel. Not settler cloth. A military coat. Federal issue. Claire climbed to his side. "Who is that?" Wakasa stared, eyes hardening into something colder than resolve. Something older. Not law, not rescue. He pointed to the coat. "That's not local. That's U.S. Army." Her stomach twisted. "They sent soldiers?" "They sent opportunity," he muttered. She didn't understand. He turned to her fully now. "They weren't just after you. That was the excuse. A settler girl taken. That gives them permission. But this," he gestured to the smoke, the blood, the line of riders growing along the ridge. "This is what they wanted." She stared at him, waiting. "They want me. They want this place." His voice was low but seething. "They want it clean. The girl running to the savage? That's a story. One they'll use to redraw borders, to move fences, to say we started it." Claire felt the ground shift beneath her, not physically, but morally. Like everything she had told herself about being the spark in this fire was only part of the truth. A smaller part. The noose around the camp hadn't been made of rope. It was made of narrative. "They'll say you kidnapped me," she whispered. "That you used me." "They already have," he replied. From below, one of the elders shouted riders approaching from the east now. A second wave. A second ring. "They're encircling us," Claire said. "They mean to erase us," Wakasa corrected. And for the first time since she arrived, she realized this wasn't a skirmish. It was a purge. And her name was stamped on the justification. They came closer this time. No charge, no shouting. Just a slow, deliberate advance through the smoke and ash, like men walking toward a ceremony, not a battle. The line of horses parted in the center, revealing the rider who led them now. Not Elias. Not the sheriff. A man Claire had never seen before, older, clean-shaven, with the kind of composure that didn't belong on a battlefield. He wore the blue coat like a skin, dusted with soot but sharp in the shoulders. Military, but not in uniform. Government, but off the books. The kind of man who smiled during executions and called it a signature. He raised a hand. In it, waving like a flag, was a torn piece of paper, stained with dirt, smudged with ash. But Claire knew it before she even saw her own name at the bottom. The letter. Her letter. He called out, loud enough for every soul on both sides to hear. This is proof. His horse stepped forward, hooves crunching over charred leaves. A settler girl, coerced, cut off from her people, begging for peace, but threatened, hiding her words like a prisoner. He held it up again. Let the crowd absorb it. Not my words, he said, hers. Claire's breath left her. Beside her, Wakasa didn't speak. His jaw was locked tight, his hands empty. Not because he had nothing to say, but because there was nothing to argue. Words written in fear were now repurposed as ammunition. The man in blue turned to his men. This justifies force. This camp has declared itself sovereign. It harbors a known fugitive. It shelters stolen women. We have authorization. No one challenged him. And just like that, everything changed. The tension that had been smoldering in the minds of a few now ignited in all. Guns were raised. Riders leaned forward. The smell of gun oil joined the smoke. Claire staggered back. No, she murmured. That's not what it meant. I wrote it to stop bloodshed. You wrote it to someone who never meant to stop it. Wakasa said flatly. And they gave it to someone who came to finish the story. The camp shifted. Murmurs spread like wind through dry grass. Eyes turned to Claire, some curious, some cold. Not accusing, not yet, but waiting. Waiting to see what would be said next. Wakasa raised one hand. Council, he called, his voice firm. And so they gathered. Around the central fire pit, under smoke-thick skies, the elders' Saturday warriors ringed the circle, weapons lowered but hands tense. Wakasa stood, not at the center but beside Claire. Not shielding her, not condemning her. Present. An elder woman looked directly at Claire. Her voice was soft, cracked with age. Did you give them this? Claire couldn't lie. Not now, not under this roof. I did, she said. But I didn't give it to him. I gave it to someone I trusted. I didn't know. Her voice faltered. You didn't know how deep the knife could go, Wakasa finished for her. The elder nodded. Then speak, child. Before the fire dies and the circle closes. Claire looked at the flame still burning, still alive, and knew the next words might decide who would be, too. The council fire crackled in the tense stillness, its flames the only voice in the space between two worlds. One drenched in blood and fear, the other straining toward survival. The riders had not charged again, not yet. They waited beyond the ridge, held back not by fear, but by optics, by the image of the tribe holding council, by the eyes of the settlers caught in the middle. They knew the power of appearances. A massacre is harder to defend when the victims are seated, unarmed, and speaking. Claire stood alone at the fire's edge, the knife in her hands. It felt heavier than before, not in weight, but in meaning. It had been given to her as a warning, then returned in trust. Now it was something else entirely. Evidence. Of what she had done. Of what she had learned. Of who she had become. The circle watched in silence. Elders, children, warriors, even some settlers who had been spared or captured in the chaos. None of them knew what she would say. Not even Wakasa. He stood a few paces back, arms crossed, face unreadable. Claire lifted the knife. I was raised to believe marriage meant safety, she said, voice steady, though her throat burned. That when a man claimed you, he sheltered you, provided for you, owned you. She looked out at the settlers, at Elias among them, at men who once danced in candlelit barns, who once helped her father mend fences and split logs. Some averted their gaze, others stared, blank. I came here thinking I was fleeing fear. What I didn't understand, she continued, was that I was the excuse for their fear and for his war. She turned now to the fire. But Wicasa never asked me to kill, never asked me to hide. He only gave me one thing. She stepped forward slow, deliberate, and placed the blade, hilt first, into Wicasa's outstretched hands. A choice. Her eyes didn't leave his. I choose this, she said. The words echoed into the stillness. The knife gleamed once in the firelight, then vanished into his palm. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the divide cracked open like thunder across dry land. Some of the settlers shouted, "She's brainwashed. This is a trick. She's lying to protect him." Others, silent, watchful, began to question. Eyes shifted between Wicasa and the blue-coated man on horseback. Between the rifles and the woman standing empty-handed, offering no plea, only choice. An elder stood. "She has spoken," he said. "Before the circle, with truth. That is enough for us." Wicasa said nothing. He did not raise the blade. Did not call for defense, he simply stood. Claire turned to face the crowd. "If you call this surrender," she said, "then you never came for peace, and you never came for me." And with that, the fire held its breath, waiting to see what would burn next. The stillness after Claire's words was not peace. It was tension held like a string between teeth, one spark away from snapping. The council fire burned low now, not for lack of fuel, but because no one dared feed it. Not yet. The decision hovered above the ridge, above the crowd, above history itself. Then came a sound no one expected. Boots, stumbling. A figure moved through the outer crowd of settlers and mercenaries, weaving between horses, eyes wide with something that wasn't panic but urgency. A boy, barely grown. Thin arms, dust-streaked face, coat too large for his shoulders. He held a rifle clumsily in one hand, like it was heavier than he'd expected. He stepped forward into the space between the camps, between the blade and the bullet, and stopped. Everyone turned. One of the soldiers reached out. "Boy, get back here." But the boy ignored him. He looked directly at Wicasa, then at Claire, then to the council. And slowly, trembling, but resolute, he threw his rifle down. The sound it made was sharp. Final. "They could have killed me," the boy said. "They didn't." A murmur rippled through the settlers. The blue-coated official scowled, but said nothing. "I crossed the line," the boy continued. "I fired first. I thought it was the right thing. I thought we were stopping something wicked." He looked toward the men who'd ridden with him. "They found me bleeding. They helped me. Fed me. Saturday with me while I cried." His voice broke, but he didn't look away. "No one beat me. No one took anything from me. They spared me, that's the truth." A silence deeper than all the rest followed. Wicasa stepped forward and laid down his bow. He set it carefully near the fire, the motion quiet, deliberate, no performance, no pride. Just a man choosing not to kill when he had every reason to. The boy flinched, but Wicasa nodded once, the same slow nod he'd given Claire the night they married. The nod that meant "I see you." The elders remained seated, still watching, still weighing. And then another voice. "I saw it too," came a call from the ridge. A settler woman. "They let my brother go when they had no reason to. Didn't touch a hair on him." Someone else threw down a weapon. Then another. Not all. Not even most. But enough. The crowd fractured visibly. Some of the mercenaries pulled back, horses already turning. Elias looked around, lost, the torch in his hand now nothing but smoke. The man in the blue coat cursed beneath his breath, seeing the tide turn. Orders unspoken hung in the air, the momentum of violence slipping. The story no longer so easy to sell. Claire stood taller, not smiling, not triumphant. Just present. Wicasa picked up the fallen rifle, not to keep, but to return it, handle first, to the boy. "Now you carry something heavier," he said. The boy nodded. And the camp breathed for the first time in days, not like prey, but like people who had chosen not to burn. The prairie had turned green again. Snowmelt had fed the rivers, and the blackened edges of the camp, once scorched by fear and fire, were now ringed with new grass. Smoke still rose from the central fire each morning, but it was thinner now, gentler, curling up into the sky not as a signal for war, but as a sign that life, against every warning, had remained. A new tent stood near the edge of camp, stitched with care, its walls painted in ochre and ash. It wasn't large, just wide enough for a cot, a fire basin, and a low shelf that held a locket, a folded letter, and a blade. The blade sat untouched. Not because it had been forgotten, but because it had done its part. Claire knelt in the grass outside the tent, her fingers tracing letters into the dirt. A small circle of children sat around her, some Lakota, some from the settlements, others with no names but the ones they'd been given after. She spoke slowly, her English plain, her tone patient. "B," she said, pointing. "Like brave. Like the ones who stayed." The children echoed her, laughed. One boy pointed to the horizon and made the sign for sunrise. Claire smiled. Not far away, Wicasa stood beneath a cottonwood, his blade pressed against a plank of weathered wood. He wasn't carving headstones. There were no graves here, only stories. The names he etched belonged to the living and the lost. The ones who had stood, the ones who had spoken, the ones who had simply stayed. He didn't look over his shoulder when Claire approached with the children, but he paused long enough to let her read the name he'd just finished. The boy who dropped his rifle. Claire laid a hand gently on his back. He didn't flinch. They stood like that for a moment, man, woman, memory, without needing to speak. The fire in the center of camp burned steadily now, day and night. Not for protection, not for cooking, but because someone always came to sit beside it, to warm their hands, to remember, to heal. And when the wind blew in from the east, as it sometimes still did, it no longer carried smoke or gunfire. It carried the scent of sage. The tent flap stirred behind her. Claire glanced inside before entering. The blade was still there, still sharp, still hers. But now, when she looked at it, she didn't think of the night he handed it to her. She thought of the morning after. She closed the flap, turned back to the light. Some fires were meant to burn everything down. But others, the rare ones, they stayed lit so we could remember how close we came. And why we chose to live instead.